So you have a scene, let's say an environment scene, that you put a lot of hours into. I mean, really put your heart into it. You did everything right. You started from the blocking stage, you practice foreground, midground and background division. The tree is right here around the golden rule sweet spot. Everything is pointing towards it. You then added all those little details like stones and fallen trunks, grass and even dandelions. And then you hit render and... yeah. So then you work some more on it and this is what you get. Yep, pretty boring. At this point, the whole thing is getting frustrating. You spend so many hours making the scene, you are completely exhausted at this point. But this? Well, it happened to me many times. If I was to tell you how many times, I'd probably be embarrassed. Twice, just for this video. Oftentimes, I hit a stage where it almost seems like some sort of good-looking final result is just not possible. Well, fortunately, there is always something you can do to make things better. Things you can add to really bring your 3D renders to life. Now, this video is not going to be about all those important fundamentals of composition, camera work and lighting that every 3D artist should know. We discussed those in my previous 2 videos focused on the topic, so check them out if you haven't already. Instead, today we will have a look at something slightly different, something more superficial, you might say. Nonetheless, something I use every time for every artwork I make. So without any further ado, let me introduce 6 ways to make your renders instantly cooler. Like this. So what I did to achieve this result was I added a blurred foreground element. Then I let clouds cast shadows on the ground. I brought the mighty weapon known as Godrays. I then added falling leaves and flying birds. And last but not least, adding atmosphere always helps to bring your scene together. After a bit of eevee tinkering and compositing, both of which I showed you in the previous videos, I then achieved something that I was reasonably happy with. And now I will quickly break down all these 6 tips. One little note before we start, when creating this image in Blender Eevee, I relied heavily on the grass element from the add-on Grasswald, generated trees from Growth add-on, and amazing photo-scanned assets from Megascans. Without these, it would take days instead of hours. I also used these awesome VDB clouds by Travis Davis, which give you a ton of options for quickly filling your Blender skies. Now, this first tip may not apply to every 3D artwork, but I myself am heavily influenced by movie compositions, probably because I studied filmmaking and some of that stuck with me. What we learned at school and when composing our shots at Everyday Shoot was to add a bit of foreground element to your scene. And ideally, make it blurry. What this does is it adds an amazing sense of depth to your shot, accentuated even more when you start moving the camera. If you look at these old masters, they rarely did it. But I think that after a century of filmmaking, this technique seeped into every area of entertainment industry, especially modern concept art. So if you go, for example, at ArtStation and browse some artwork, you will often find this element present. Here it is. And here. And here. Here too. You get the picture. So what I've done in my scene was to take a tree model and put it towards the camera where it works nicely. For example, here and on this side here. Then I switched on the depth of field option and right off the bat, things started to work much nicer. Not only does it add more depth, it can also frame your images nicely. And that's just step 1. For my 3D work, I like to gather all sorts of reference sheets. And in this case, looking at many images, it became obvious that landscape shots almost always look more epic when there are these huge cloud shadows moving across them. Especially when you compare it to a photo without shadows, it becomes quite obvious. This technique is actually very easy. In Blender, it won't take you more than a few minutes, but it adds tons of awesomeness to your images. Let's demonstrate here on a simple scene where I have this ground plane and a plane above where I want my clouds to be. Let's actually switch to eevee. And now you can already see that when you have a top-down light, your top object is of course casting shadows onto the bottom one. Now I want this shadow to be more cloudy and random. For that purpose, I used to import various images of clouds with alpha, making light cast shadows through them. However, that proved more performance heavy than necessary. There is an easier and faster solution, one that I nowadays use almost exclusively. All you need to do is to plug noise texture into the alpha socket of the principal shader, and to make it work in eevee, you always need to go to the shader options and set the blend mode and shadow mode to alpha blend, and for example alpha hashed. Only then will the opacity take effect. Okay, then play around with the settings and plug in the color ramp node to drive the softness and hardness, and with the noise node selected, if you hit Ctrl T, of course, you must have the Node Wrangler add-on active in the settings. You get this mapping node where you can simply move your cloud shadows to the side, rotate them, and even scale them. Super fast, super easy, and also tileable. And you can really get creative with these, darkening areas you don't need the viewers to look at, highlighting those most important spots of your image. Not to mention, you can use them in all your 3D scenes, not just landscapes. For example here, let's jump back to the previous tutorial scene with Shaolin Monk Su by Juan Hernandez and use the same clouds in smaller scale to cast shadows on his face. Of course, filling your scene with glow and blooms and light shafts of all sorts is generally frowned upon. If you do not have a good image base to start off, well, then no amount of glow or rays will save you. But let's say that the base of your image is okay, then adding this little detail is something I love to do. Basically on all of my images, be it in more or less prominent form. Creating light rays that you can put directly into your scene is pretty easy. First, you need a black and white image with these rays, which you can create for example in Photoshop, GIMP, or just download them online. You then put this image into your scene with the Import Images as Planes option, and just plug it into the alpha. Again, don't forget the blending modes in the shader setup, and done. There is something about leaves falling through your scene that is just so damn amazing and poetic. Lately I've been playing the new samurai game Ghost of Tsushima, and watching the leaves fly and fall everywhere really made me think how much it adds to the overall atmosphere. Little thing, but so powerful. So let's make our own falling leaves in Blender. Shall we? I started with getting some nice leaf textures. In my case, I downloaded them with free credits on textures.com, and you can do it too. There, I found these maple leaves, but you can definitely use different sources. Many you can even download for free from BlendSwap, some even pre-made in Blender. Other you can find among Megascan's assets if you are subscribed to Quixel. In Photoshop, GIMP, or any other photo manipulation software, you put all these images together to a texture atlas, save it as PNG with alpha, you then import it as a plane to Blender and cut each individual leaf. You can subdivide the planes, shape it a little bit, and even play around with the shading, maybe adding some specular and bump. Let's make a camera here and aim it somewhere in the air, and then put all these leaves into a separate collection. And then add a simple object, for example a plane, and onto it put particle simulation. Activate the collection parameter here and choose our leaves collection to be the source. And to make the particles not disappear throughout the simulation, make their lifetime something larger than your timeline. In my case, it's 2000. Also, let's increase the damping in Physics tab. That will make the leaves fall somewhat slower, like they're very light, which they are. And 0.5 seems to be about right now. And also, I don't like that they're all falling uniformly. So let's add some rotation here and activate this dynamic checker, open up angular velocity, leave this velocity value here and set a value of 4 down here. Or less or more, if you like, depending on how fast you want the leaves to spin. To add more randomness, play with the values here. Now that's looking better. And looking at this, there was still a lot of uniformity in the simulation. One thing I've done to fix it was to add in several physics fields. First a wind, making it blow a little stronger to the side, with a little stronger value here, like 22. The plane then needed some repositioning for the leaves to remain in the shot. Then adding turbulence field with size of 2 and strength of about 50 helped with the randomness too, creating these very nice pathways in the air, really almost like in Ghost of Tsushima. Limiting the number of particles and putting them out of focus finalized the result for me, which I then appended into my scene with the fields and all, cached it, and bam, falling leaves right at your fingertips. This next tip may be a little bit more advanced. Nevertheless, it's another one that I like to use maybe too much, adding birds. To add birds into your still renders, you may of course simply use an image. Or for moving shots, you may, let's say, go out, into nature, away from your computer. So that's what outdoor looks like. Take your camera and film some flying birds, then get rid of the sky, and here you go. Or you can stay home and create your birds in Blender. There you can really control the number and movement of your flocks, so it can often be the best option. For that purpose, I downloaded this seagull model from BlendSwap, made by a user called FNAX, and I added a very simple shape key animation to it. In edit mode, I edited the mesh to be this shape, and with it, I created this basis default state in the shape keys menu. I then jumped again into edit mode, and by tinkering with the mesh again, I created one shape key where the wings were down. If I then started scrubbing through this value, it looked like the bird is flapping its wings. You can of course make this animation look much nicer than me, but I figured my birds would be too small to notice a bad animation. I then keyframed the shape key at a value of 0 and frame 0. I went to frame 20, keyframed it at value of 1, and then at frame 40, added again value of 0. This way we create a very simple flapping cycle. To make it repeat infinitely, I selected all my keyframes with A and hit Shift E, activating this super useful cyclic command here. Never ending flapping, here we go. I then put my bird into a collection and called it bird particles, and with that I duplicated the model several times and made variations to the cyclic animation for each bird. In some cases making it faster or adding second cycle of animation with different shape key values so that they appeared to be different birds. And thus my bird particles were ready. Now I created an object, this big sphere, and I made an emitter particle system using collection setting and the birds group in this render section here. But nothing was happening. Well, watch out for that, because Blender remembers the last active collection and it puts new objects in it. So this sphere where we have our particle simulation was created inside of the bird particles group, and then the simulation can't really work. So take it out and whee! It's raining tiny little birds. I made them bigger here, and then the real fun started. Because when I activated this voids option in the physics section, all sorts of weird stuff started happening. First off, it's better to hide the emitter both here and also in the viewport display so we can see better what's going on. The birds at this point started rotating and focusing on the emitter object, basically like some sort of flying insect. That's however not what I wanted. I wanted birds, so we need to change the behavior a little bit. Before that, however, I checked the object rotation option here and then rotated my original particles 90 degrees, because before that they were flying sideways. Now, while this looked cool, an awesome flocking bird chaos, this is actually not how flocks behave. They tend to flock together, following a goal, and often one leading bird. Fortunately, that's exactly what you can set up in these Boyd settings here. So I wanted the birds to cross the scene, heading towards this cube, behaving in a somewhat less mothy way. In this Boyd brain settings here, you have all sorts of fun rules to play with. You can add goal and specify the cube to be the bird's destination. You can add separate command to make them fly away from each other, and a flock command, making them do the opposite, and also a follow leader command. Take note, the order in which you add these is important. With this fuzzy option set, it happens from the top. So, for example now, first they will separate, then they will realize they have to follow the leader, upon which they will try to follow their goal while following the leader and flocking together. It is really very straightforward and awesome fun playing with these particles and their behavior. I went through numerous settings, also tinkering with the movement tab, lowering some of the max airspeed, max acceleration and angular velocity, and you can decrease the personal space to make the flock tighter. And by the way, you can very quickly add a new flock of birds by simply going to edit mode and duplicating the sphere, then putting it somewhere else. These were my final settings. I went with much lower number of birds, lower personal space for them, and this order of commands. And then I added some music and let them chase this irresistible invisible cube. We talked about atmosphere and how to create it in the 10 tips to make your scene more cinematic, and in this new scene I even used a similar way to add the atmospheric depth as I did there. I used cube, put a principled volume shader on it, and with some very low numbers it gave me this nice misty effect. However, let's now demonstrate some other methods you can do this. Apart from this 3D fog, which is awesome, especially with light sources, higher anisotropy, and some bloom effect, you can also achieve this in other ways, some even more performance efficient than this. For example, with 2D elements. Let me quickly add a terrain with ant landscape here, some mountains and a lower mountainous area in the foreground, and duplicate this one. And now we have basically 3 planes, a foreground, a midground, and a background. Then I can add the customary cube with principled volume shader, make the density 0.02, anisotropy 0.5, and have a very strong spotlight shine through it. Now this may function both as an atmosphere and with higher density as a mist or a fog. However, if you have more defined ground planes, like I have here, I can divide those by 2D layers of atmosphere. You simply make a plane, plug a gradient texture with linear mode into the alpha socket, and I will repeat myself, but please don't forget to set the blend mode and shadow mode here to make it work. With this setup, it's just a matter of rotating the gradient placement -90 degrees, and with color ramp, slightly limiting the area with black point, bring the intensity of the whites up. Place your atmosphere plane on the borders of the foreground and midground, and then one even in front of the camera. And while this is sort of a cheat, not really how a true atmosphere works, I think it serves the purpose quite nice. And there is actually one more slightly advanced thing you can do here. I have this fog texture right here. Again, I put it on a plane and set it up the way I set up my previous transparent planes. Then I create a large ground plane spanning almost the whole scene, and on this plane create a particle system where I use this fog plane to instance it many times over the surface and rotate the image planes to face the camera with the rotation here. This, combined with the other atmospheric planes and the mist volume, usually gives a pretty cool result even on an ugly scene like this. In the final scene, I used the atmospheric plane to divide the midground from the background. I added the mist volume to have a bit of that volumetric light catching effect, and also added a little bit of dust planes here and there. And that was it. With a bit of compositing work, added contrast and vignette, The final image went a long way from where we originally started. All that with just a few techniques, ones that are helping to bring my artwork to life for many years now. I definitely recommend streamlining these, so create your own collections of flying birds, falling leaves, planes with light rays and atmosphere, and whenever you are close to finishing your new 3D artwork, you just append them into your scene and reuse them whenever you like, because I guarantee you, when you use them once, you will be using them always. To get some of these assets I used in this video, you can subscribe to the CG Boost resources at cgboost.com/resources and download them from there. Actually, do you have your own ways to bring 3D artwork to life? Definitely share your tips in the comments, I can't wait for them. But with that, stay creative my friends, and until next time, Martin out.